Go ahead.
Zach and I are here, and we're going to talk about some radical ideas like we always do. In this case, Zach and I are trying to present alternative visions and narratives of what a drug use and addiction are about. And there's a movement to do that. We're not the only people doing that, although I got in early. Of course, Carl Hart's talking about letting people know that heroin and other drug use doesn't follow the ensemble motive where everybody walks in lockstep, that everybody believes is true. And a little bit before him, Johann Hari, of course, has a runaway TED's video where he says everything you believe about addiction is wrong. So let me just throw you a question, Zach. How come, and given Johann's amazing reach, that's got almost 20 million viewers, how come everybody loves that and yet everybody still believes the same things about addiction and drugs? How does that work? That Johann's wildfire viral TED's talk is out there and everybody still says and believes the same thing. How does that combine? Do you know? Can you figure that out?
I have a few ideas about it, and I don't know if it's the direction you want to be going or not, but Johann is able to drape great stories and nice sounding things around that whole bit about everything you think you know about drugs and drug use is wrong. People love to have their minds blown, kind of a thing. And at the same time, people like to feel comfortable believing what they believe. And he does a pretty good job of doing both of those things. I think that the problem is that the truth at the deepest level is not always super nice. Doesn't always jibe with the way that we're already living and the things that we already believe. So, really digging at the truth, you have to be willing to seem harsh to people. And I don't think that Johann has that bite to him, really. I mean, he talks about controversial things, and he elevates the conversation to a much deeper level. But I think that there's still some hesitancy on his end to go all the way with some of those truths. And I think that's pretty easily how people can listen to it, still not change beliefs in a fundamental way.
It's he has his greatest skill is at kind of digging a hole without creating much dirt. He sort of establishes some new ideas. Here, why don't you think about this? But he doesn't really challenge people, and people don't like to be challenged. I mean, things are myths and conventional cultural narratives for a reason, and everybody buys into them for a reason, and they occupy a role that's not easily discarded.
Actually, to be fair, though, I mean, I know he's had his run-in with critics and people who hate him because he wrote, that antidepressants aren't the single magic bullet and so he's willing to be controversial, and it's not like he hasn't helped people wrap their minds around the concepts any better. I think people have, gained a lot from his work. So just to be completely fair,
I mean, the mental health and the antidepressant thing, it's controversial. And well, everybody accepts antidepressants universally. They're not going anywhere. There certainly has been a lot of challenges to them. The addiction thing is something that's, that you're depressed, it can be treated thing is big. And the addiction thing is, addiction is so fundamental to our thinking. That would really take some high explosives to get that off people's minds. I mean, another aspect of this is, as universal as Johann is, as popular as Carl is, and I know you've been talking to Maya, as much as Maya gets out there and kind of weaves around, you're still fighting for every one of those. There's still hundreds of thousands, millions of propagated information that reaffirm people's existing biases and prejudices and errors in thinking. And I wanted to talk today about Medium. Medium has a regular appearing column by a recovering alcoholic about getting people to stop drinking. That's his goal. And he has some famous examples of it, and he promotes them, and they're the lead talk about in Medium. Now, you and I are presenting alternative narratives. So we talked about Demi Lovato and how the whole standard abstinence thing didn't work for her. And in fact, it almost it came close to killing her. So I'm titling this little talk, Killing You Softly in the Greek Connection. And the latest thing that appeared in Medium, and it's always broadcast, why Zach Galifianakis stopped drinking.
Galifianakis.
Galifianakis, thank you. And Bradley Cooper isn't the only hangover star who's gotten sober. So I'm going to begin by making a pretty radical statement. I think that propagating this image, forcefully presenting abstinence and giving up alcohol, kills more people than it saves. Do you have any reaction to that statement? I mean, you could start with Demi Lovato. How do you respond to my saying that?
Anyone can come up with the idea that if they believe that a thing is killing them, well, just prohibiting the use of that thing should save their lives. It's not like a multidimensional crazy idea. But the idea that you must stop doing some object that seems to be bogging you down goes a step farther. And so my reaction is to be in completely agreement with you. And people will, of course, immediately take that as saying abstaining from something can't be a part of living a good life or recovery or whatever. And of course, that's not what you mean. And I know that. But
well, with Demi Lovato, she said specifically that forcing herself into that little cubbyhole of abstinence led to her having an incredibly explosive relapse. She took everything. And that, when you think about it, she's still a young woman. I mean, that was in her 20s. That's not an uncommon response. That kind of like, oh, I'll keep the lid on it and now I'll blast off. So as a therapy technique, it's got a specific downside. Now, obviously, I guess some people succeed in abstaining. You know, Galifianakis, is that his name? Mm-hmm. So, you know, he's going to abstain for the next 30 or 40 or 50 years. I mean, it might have taken, Demi Lovato would have had to go maybe 50 or 60 years. The odds are against it. But I'm going to, by the end of this little conversation, broaden that whole conception of how the abstinence zero tolerance model is killing us. But we're focusing right now on clinical issues. You have a person who feels they have a problem. What do? Now, you and I are part of a program, the Life Process program. And nothing I express here, by the way, is and on the behalf of the Life Process program. This is our own little video chat. How do we deal with, we're harm reduction, and you just expressed a point of view. What's harm reduction mean in terms of goals with clients?
Yeah, well, accepting that they're going to do whatever they're going to do and invite them into the space enough to be honest about what they want and what they feel that their behaviors are going to be or what their limits are.
So we don't endorse, I mean, we endorse in the fact that we accept controlled drinking or controlled substance use as one outcome, which is called harm reduction. But we don't tell anybody to do anything, which only makes sense because, as with Demi Lovato or anybody, especially with alcohol, but with any drug, really, you're not going to really get anybody to do or not do what you tell them to do. They're going to make some kind of a decision. And we enhance their decision-making capacity and go along with them in traveling along that route. So the first point I made is that forcing people into abstinence is seeing that as their only option can be disastrous and often is disastrous. The second point I'm making is, as a clinical goal, I'm going to say something strong here. The person who writes these things for Medium, I'm not 100% sure. It might just be an AA. He's talks about being a recovering alcoholic. He's trying to help people. You cannot be a helper if your only option is abstinence. You cannot help people if you say to them, oh, I'm going to help you quit. If that, you're not a certified helper, therapist. I mean, you are a certified AA member, but you're not really qualified. I'm accusing you of professional malpractice if that's what your sign says. I am a helper for people with addictive problems. Quit. That's what we're going to do. Now, just to take one other step back, in the Life Process program, of course, we deal with eating, we deal with shopping, we deal with sex, we deal with love relationships. That expansion should make evident and obvious what's true. Abstinence can't possibly apply across the board at eating, I should say, for addictive problems. It can't. It doesn't make any sense with that. But even with things that you don't need to live, for the most part, drugs and alcohol, it doesn't make sense. Now, of course, with drugs, we get into a whole complicated conversation about, well, what is abstinence exactly? And there's this ongoing negotiation. Well, I abstain from any psychoactive drugs, except, if I have to go to the hospital, then I take them. Like any human, but not many people volunteer to endure pain with that analgesia. And then you sort of start wondering, well, why is it different when you get in the hospital than if you score it in the street? And then you're into a whole other realm.
Mm-hmm. A man that you know and that I just met, Sean Shelley, just wrote an article on, actually he piggybacked on Mark Lewis's blog. Mark Lewis, for people who don't know, a neuroscientist and wrote books about addiction, and he's a non-disease kind of a guy. And Sean teaches a class where he tries to get people to epistemic bedrock about what is a drug anyway. And people have a really, really tough time doing it. His point, of course, is that it falls into gray categories. And so trying to make a statement about which drugs you should do or shouldn't do, it gets a little silly at some point.
And Carl makes the point that the chemical structure of Adderall, is has the same structure as meth.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, painkillers, opioids are the same chemical structure as opiates, like heroin. So anyhow, Zach Galifianakis stopped drinking. Bradley Cooper isn't the only hangover star who's gotten sober. And he asked him, well, what made you quit? And he said, well, I've had, numerous incidents. As he was crossing the street, a man in a Jaguar cut him off. Angered by the man, he drunkenly hit the car as hard as he can with his hands. In response, the driver and the passenger got out of the car and both spit into his face at the same time. Galifianakis tried to get them back by taking an empty beer can from the trash and throwing it at the car, but he was so drunk that he missed. He said that this incident, along with others, convinced him that he needed to quit. How do you react to that incident?
Well, he needed to quit something. He needed to figure out what events led to bigger events, so that he acted so impulsively and destructively.
I'm imagining, walking the streets drunkenly, ready for a fight, that's one thing. That obviously a lot of people drink without doing that. Obviously, a lot of people get drunk without doing that. Some people get withdrawn when they're drunk. Galifianakis went out in the street drunk, confronted a car, ended up smashing it. And then, of course, you always wonder, well, what was the limit then? Why didn't he pull out a gun and shoot them? And then you might say, well, I'm not that crazy. And then you say, well, how crazy are you? You threw a beer can at them. It becomes a fine line. For some people, they are that crazy, of course. And then you say, so you were able, not to, reach in and punch the guy. You didn't have a weapon. So you had some control, but not too much control. So you're in another fine area. And as you say, if you're a therapist, you might say, I don't know, or did you intentionally try and get into a confrontation? What's Does that often happen to you? Has this happened to you in other areas of your life?
So he needed to adjust his priors before drinking and, drinking to oblivion, I guess. But like you're saying, there was a cutoff somewhere. I mean, he didn't do crazier things than he did. And so what kept him from doing it? Or does he think maybe he would do those crazy things, which is anyway.
And that's why he quit. I mean, you might say, well, maybe you should only drink at home. If you're a person who I mean, you could suggest to some people, women in particular, that drinking outside of the house is a dangerous activity and they shouldn't do it. So then you're dealing with, that's called harm reduction. You're trying to, you want to minimize certainly life-threatening events, but harmful events, legal events, physical damage. So the author of this piece says, as recovering alcoholics, these types of interactions are all too familiar with me. And so everybody who has a drinking problem, I mean, Galifianakis had a good story. I don't know if Bradley Cooper had a story like that. And this helper, who's not a helper, said, well, it's a simple answer, stop drinking. I'm writing my memoir, and I've never gotten in a fight while drinking. I've never walked. I've been in the streets. I've only been drunk a few times my whole life. I've been in the streets drunk or stoned, but I've never gotten in any confrontations with anybody. That's not my approach to consuming substances. However, like most people, I have some very positive experiences with drugs and alcohol. Let me illustrate the positive. This is from my memoir. Let me illustrate the positive side of alcohol and human socialization by describing dinner the evening before my 2018 presentation in County Galway. At dinner with me were Liam, another public health, a friend of mine in Galway, who invited me. Another public health model advocate. The public health model says that the more alcohol is consumed in a society, the more problems there are. And I described, Liam said I should use his name, which I do in the memoir. Every time we went somewhere, Liam said, drinking is increasing in Galway County. And it's not. It's decreasing and problems are increasing, which is, he can't get his mind, he likes me.
He really does. He actually messaged me and told me so that he likes you. So
he can't get his head around the idea that, well, drinking problems are drinking more, and they're not, in fact, that they're not directly correlated. He can't get his head around that. Mm-hmm. So at dinner with me were Liam, another public health model advocate, my Northern Irish business partner, Dahi, who you know, and a leading Irish cognitive behavioral psychologist and motivational interviewing instructor. Before dinner, Liam took me to pick up another speaker at the conference to take to the hotel. After dinner, Liam took me to a pub for a nightcap Guinness, where he ran into other people he knew and had a drink or two with them. Liam's a man about town. Everybody likes him. He tries to help people, and he's married and has 4 kids. And I got away with cutting him up about his theory or his way of thinking by using him and his wife as an example of people who are not addicted to love. They've been together 30 some years. They have 4 children. They've been through a ton together. They went to college together. They're extremely supportive, and not every wife, Liam's out, he's taking me to dinner and those other people, he's having a nightcap. Liam's not sitting around worrying that if he gets home late and his wife smells alcohol in his breath, that she's going to, shoot him. She knows he's okay. At dinner, the 5 of us shared several bottles of wine and some Irish whiskey. At dinner, everyone told stories and made serious points, was a thoughtful listener, laughed, and enjoyed themselves. Of course, I've had similar drug experiences, including at TPA conferences. It was just a great evening. I mean, we had good food. We ate while we drank. everybody had brought something to the table. Everybody was smart. Everybody knew. Everybody was trained in listening to other people. Everybody there, by nature and by profession, knew how to respond to people. I mean, nobody was going to break out into a fight. Nobody was going to even argue with other people, even though I don't agree with the public health thing, that, we were going to have a great evening together. All of us were embedded in our families and committed to our work. We drank in a supportive, mindful, and stimulating setting. Being engaged in meaningful activities and relationships in a supportive group or community is the best guarantee of avoiding addiction. This is in a section where I write why I'm not addicted. Because, I've taken a fair share of drugs. I've certainly drunk enough alcohol. And then I say everything else is a stopgap measure bound more or less to fail. Begging people not to use drugs or drink, telling Demi Lovato not to take drugs, telling Carrie Fisher not to take drugs, punishing them or treating them for doing so, creating elaborate theories of the irresistible addictiveness of this or that substance are fool's errands. So the best thing, I began by saying that helper was actually encouraging individuals, some of whom were going to go fall off a cliff, that they could only do one thing. I'm saying as a policy, and as a therapist, he's inadequate. He shouldn't be practicing. As a policy, we know it fails to say, well, we're not going to cut out alcohol. And in fact, the entire trend, it's slow, but the entire trend in Ireland, as well as in North America, is to saying, well, we're going to let people take drugs. Telling people, well, don't take drugs and we're going to arrest you, that obviously just doesn't work. And so we're now in a place where we're saying, how do people manage their lives in combination with being able to take drugs? And we're going to get to the bottom line that there's no other answer other than having people engage in meaningful activities and relationships in a supportive group or community. And
the biggest thing that's missing from a prescription of abstinence or a prescription of whatever, is
zero tolerance, which is like a policy. That's
right.
Not
The policy of, yeah, but or even just the policy of, well, you should take drugs. It fails to just be listening to the individual. That's part of what you and I would count as harm reduction. There's something either that somebody is trying to tell a helper, a therapist, or that maybe they need help with but aren't able to articulate it. And then that also is the job of a therapist, to either listen to what's being said overtly or to try to piece out what it is that the person really needs and help them articulate it. So that's what that completely.
That's at a clinical level.
Yes. But still, it still fails to, even at a policy level, a one-size-fits-all solution still fails to allow the voice of a person having a problem at the table to explain themselves, or to be able to even know that there are problems underlying their drug use or alcohol use or whatever it is that are worth dealing with.
And it leads to, at a policy level, it leads to a misleading conclusion. Let's cut back on prescribing painkillers,
Yes,
which we did in America. That drug deaths still increased.
Right.
In Galway, it meant let's curtail drinking, and they did, but problems still increased. It leads to the wrong thing, but it does one more subtle, complex thing. In a world where everybody can and does consume substances. I mean, I guess we can find somebody that doesn't, but I don't know where. And if you're starting out with a young person, you say, here's my plan for you. You'll never take a drug or drink alcohol. That's not a plan. And especially complicating that is the fact that we prescribe psychoactive, like Adderall, powerful psychoactive substances to young, and antidepressants to young people. So the whole plan is psychotic. And instead, our whole mission and my whole goal is to incorporate substance use in Carl Hart's goal as a normal human behavior that has to be regulated by exactly the same things as every other way. So I want to tell some Greek stories now. I'm going to talk about cultural differences now. Always a dangerous place. But Galifianakis, how do you say his name?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
I believe that's a Greek name. And Greeks are very close to me. You've met a friend of mine, Anne, who you've lived years of her life in Greece. And at her 90th birthday party, I'll tell you the story I told. Everybody got up and celebrated, by saying something about her. I said, well, I was with Anne when we picked out the wines that we're drinking tonight. I don't know, there were 40 people there. This is the kind of thing I actually check. Everybody got wine and everybody drank the wine. Anne, I guess she doesn't hang at a recovery crowd, I guess. Although, except Anne, she's over 90 and somewhere along the line, as I'll describe, she stopped drinking wine. Although I was with her when she picked out the wines for this party, and she drank like a thimbleful of each wine to taste it. So she knows a lot about wine, but she doesn't drink because somewhere along the line, getting to be 90, that didn't work for her digestively anymore. Her grandson and his girlfriend were there. They certainly weren't 21. They had wine too. So this is a New York City crowd. And there were a lot of Jewish people, and Jews have a Mediterranean outlook towards alcohol like the Greeks do. Just speaking about alcohol and attitudes towards it, if I go to a bar in New York City, which I used to do, and if I say to the bartender, what percentage of people drink, what answer do they give me?
A bartender would likely say nearly everybody.
Yes, but it's a bartender in New York. And more or less everybody in New York does drink alcohol. So, I can stump people, say, in the United States of America, barely over 50% of people drink. There are states, of course, there's Utah, and then, which is Mormon, but Southern Protestant states where there's extremely high levels of abstinence, but they also have extremely high levels of problem drinking. So let's get back to my story about Anne. I got up and I said, Anne's, and I use this in the most respectful way possible, is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And one of my great pleasures in going around with her in New York, but she lived in Greece for a long time. And she grew up in the Midwest. And my greatest thrill is to go to a Greek diner. And I always say, Anne, talk to him in Greece. Talk to him in Greek. And then, when this sort of, pale Midwestern blurts out Greek, I've never once, the guy lights up, smiles, and starts talking to her in Greek. And so at one point, as I told in the story, I said, were your people temperance? Because temperance in America, which occupies roughly, half the population, is rooted in Southern and Midwestern Protestantism. And that's Anne's roots. So I said, I once said to Anne, were your people temperance? And she said, no. And I said, well, she grew up in Illinois. When you went to a family gathering in Illinois, did they serve, beer or wine or punch? And she said, no. And I said, well, when you had a Sunday dinner and your parents made, your mom made a roast and all, did you have red wine or white wine with fish? She said, no. And then she said, but on Christmas, my mother made eggnog. And I said, good enough. We'll accept that as a correct answer. And then Anne told me a story. She's an artist, but her chief work was writing a book about her great aunt, who was a Midwestern like her, went to Europe and became a well-known painter. And one day when Anne was at college, she came home as a junior at 20 years old, and her aunt had brought a bottle of wine, 2 bottles. And it was good wine. And I said, then I'm giving this little tour. I said, Anne, could you describe that wine? And then Anne starts going, well, it really affected about, and she starts gesticulating towards her taste buds. And then I go, gee, that made a big impression on old Anne 50 years ago. And then her son-in-law said, that was 70 years ago. She was 20 and now she was 90. So Old Anne, and then my joke was Old Anne was not going to move back to Illinois or Western Pennsylvania. She was doomed for that experience. And then when she lived in Greece, she would drink a half a liter of white wine for lunch and dinner every day she was there. She's not a giant woman. That was a fairly substantial amount of alcohol. So the Greek connection is really, an important one to me, and how Greeks drink wine like water. And yet it's a culture where people don't have a lot of social problems around alcohol. And I cite epidemiological data that shows the remarkable thing that Americans, we can't even get into it. We've discussed it before. There's actually an inverse relationship. Societies where more alcohol is consumed have fewer problems with alcohol than societies where less is consumed. And the reason for that is the ones where less is consumed tend to drink in binges. They less often drink wine and beer and drink intense spirits, although that's not the whole cause of it. And it's an all or nothing kind of an experience where in Greece and the Mediterranean, alcohol is consumed as an ordinary part of life. It's considered something you do at meals, in groups, in a convivial, social manner. You don't go out and punch people or smack their cars or shoot them. It's got a whole different meaning in life. And so the image of alcohol that's being created and perpetuated, we've talked about clinical practice, we've talked about policy, and now I'm talking about a whole cultural attitude towards substances. We're not going to be able to fight substance use. We've tried that. We're trying it to some degree. We're trying it now, but there's a general awareness, sort of even people that kind of favor the drug war, and Joe Biden's one of them, kind of know that doesn't work. Everybody kind of knows we need a new conception of integrating our lives with drugs and alcohol, and we're somewhere in the middle of a process of dealing with that. From saying, well, we're not going to allow people to smoke marijuana. Marijuana is essentially legal in the United States. They're now passing marijuana decriminalizing marijuana in Arizona, for God's sake. Conservative states are doing it now. Virginia, for example. So once you accept that something is a part of people's lives, you approach it in a whole different way. You realize that somehow you've got to really integrate it. And how do you deal with that kind of an experience? And so when we're getting back to the initial question. I mean, Carl Hart is saying, we need to normalize drug use. Johann Hari is saying, we're thinking about addiction the wrong way. And the way I put it is, addiction is not caused by drugs or alcohol. Addiction is something else. Galifianakis' behavior is related to something else. It's not eliminated as an individual or culture-wide by eliminating one substance or another. And so we've got to come to grips with these things, both clinically and culturally. And, the original question I was asking was, what image do we put forward in society of drugs and alcohol? And we're in a space where we're now saying, marijuana, it's okay. I mean, nothing bad has happened from legalizing marijuana anywhere. Everybody's kind of, but it's shrugging their shoulders now. How we deal psychedelic drugs now are being promoted, ketamine and ibogaine and a ton of substances are all being put forward now as therapeutic agents. And we're thinking about, obviously they're in the old days, I'm so old, but used to be warned against those things because they make you go crazy. There's some kind of range of experiences people have and ways in which those are integrated in life, for better or for worse. We're in a process with drugs of kind of moving in the direction of normalization. In the case of alcohol is sort of already normalized. I mean, people already know about alcohol. Nobody's talking about making alcohol illegal. And yet there's this back drag. We're having people go out and say, oh, alcohol, that's going to end Galifianakis's problems by him abstaining. Look, it stopped my problems. And not only it's a clinical practice, it's a policy, and it's a cultural way of thinking about substances. And we need a new way of thinking about substances. And although we're in a process with drugs, we're not done with that process with alcohol. And so, as I began by saying, this man who has a tremendous platform, I couldn't tell you, I don't know how many millions of people read Medium, and he's the lead article whenever he writes about famous people. At the same time, there are people like Demi Lovato, who we've pointed out is pointing out a different narrative about her efforts to recover. She now drinks and smokes marijuana. She's off opioids and some other drugs, I believe. At the same time that's going on, we're constantly flooding the earth, the planet, the United States with the message: drugs, alcohol, bad, cause problems, quit them. It's the only way not to encounter problems. It's the only way to get over problems. And so that's the battle that we're ensconced in.
Reminds me of I was on Twitter. I keep getting in trouble on social media, but there was someone wrote one of those. I don't even know what the fact was, that the U.S. consumes or buys or is home to something like a quarter or one half of the entire world's opioids or something like that. And all I did was I retweeted it and I wrote, well, what a great country. And people got very ferociously angry at that, so I wound up taking it down. But it's in line with what you're saying.
Global burden of disease. The United States has the first most problem with psychostimulants and the second most problems with opioids. So we're not doing a good job of it. We do have a lot of it. But, opioids, well, cocaine, they had it in Latin America and people didn't know they had a problem. And opioids that we consume in some cases badly, although most people, of course, take painkillers without problems, that come from Middle East, Turkey, or from Asia, they've had them for centuries, for as long as those civilizations have existed. So and for decades before your time, we were constantly trying to cut off opioids coming in from the border, which we still are doing, and that never ever succeeds. And the idea of having an educational program for the correct use of opioids, although we do have one. By the way, I've got a confession to make. I'm currently on opioids because I had a procedure and they sent me home with a prescription, with a little bottle of, what did they give me? Zach, what would they have given me? What drugs am I taking?
Hydrocodone.
Hydrocodone. And they actually said to me, how many do you want? And I went lowball. I picked 10. Well, I was going to have to pay for them. You know what I mean? So they weren't giving them to me. And I don't know what the top answer would be.
Have they helped you?
Huh?
Have they helped you? Have you taken them and they've helped you?
I could have existed without them. I had an operation some time ago on my foot and I went home and I didn't put 2 and 2 together and realized I couldn't get to the pharmacy. And I didn't realize that my foot didn't hurt because I had just gotten out of the operating room and they know how to deal with that. And when I got home, they said, the doctor said, oh, this isn't a serious recovery. Just don't get out of bed for 2 days. And it hurt a lot. And I could have used a painkiller and I didn't have one, but I survived that. This time, the pain was never that great. I took all 10. I took the last one last night. And now I'm down to an over-the-counter painkiller. I can't remember the name of those either. It's not Motrin. It's something. But, I take one of those a day. So I'm not, well, most people react to painkiller. Everybody, when you ask people, one of the greatest sources for painkillers that kids use is content. People take half their prescriptions and they leave them in their cabinet because they're figuring, I don't know, maybe I'll need this again. And so my response is standard. It's a normal human response. You take a painkiller and then it stops hurting and you say, okay, I guess I won't take it now. Even if some people find the experience, levitating or pleasant or positive, that's just how human beings normally act, because they have families and they have lives and they have work to do. And, I'm writing my memoir and I'm walking to the Greek cafe. The guy who owns the local diner's Greek. They do have great spinach pie. You can't beat that. The Greeks are the highest civilization of the history of the earth, but don't let me get started. So, I don't know how often you interview people who are currently on opioids, although, like I said, I used the last one last night, and I seem to be okay.
You're not looking through your couch cushions for money for more or something like that? Yeah. All right. Anything else before we conclude?
No, it's our little effort, our small little effort to contribute to a counter narrative to the world of drugs and alcohol.